So in this video we're going to be looking at the business cycle, and we're going to be looking at the different stages of it, and that's going to be the first part of this. And then we're also going to try to take a look real briefly, and it's going to be an overview of the different causes of the business cycle itself. You know, the business cycle simply says that the economy goes up and the economy comes down, and so what we want to do is look at that and look how that looks on a graph, and then start to look at the more important thing, and that is what may be causing some of it. And so as you can see here, we've got gross domestic product, and so we're measuring GDP. And so remember, we measure the business cycle using GDP. And if you'll notice up here, it says chained dollars. And so think for just a second, what do you think chained dollars might mean? Because it is a very relevant thing. And that is, if it's a chained dollar, that means that they're chaining it to a year. And so that by chaining the dollars, that makes it makes it real GDP and not nominal. So anyway, so that's what the chain dollars means. So this is our graph of the last, let's see, 1990 to 2012, of the last 22 years. And so you can see this is for the U.S. U.S. And so as you can see, these shaded areas, what do you notice happening in the shaded areas to GDP? That not so much. This one big time. You notice that GDP takes a downward turn in those shaded areas. And so the graph that I've pulled off, and this is from economagic.com, which is a great website for generating charts for U.S. data. The graph that I've pulled off shows the recessions in a shaded in area. So as you can see, we have a recession from a little bit into 1990 going into 91. Then we had a mild recession from 2001 to 2002, and then we had what's known as the Great Recession from 2008 to sometime in 2009. And so, as you can see, that a recession is simply defined as this economic downturn. So let's talk about first the stages of a business cycle. So stages. We've got some pen issues here. Stages of, there we go, business cycle. All right, and so the first stage we'll talk about is the peak, and the peak is simply the top of a business cycle. So this would be the peak, and then we look for another top here for some reason, and I don't understand it exactly, but there's a dip here and then it goes up here, so I'm not exactly sure why the recession doesn't come over just a little bit. May have something to do with how we define recession. We'll get to that in just a second, but anyway, you can see over here, here's a peak, and so the top is the peak, and then when we start to come down, when the economy starts to do poorly, or it has negative growth, we call that a contraction. And that's negative growth. Now, real quick, you can see that there might be one or two instances where there is a contraction, but we don't call that a recession. That's because a recession is a very technical term, and a recession is defined as two consecutive quarters of negative GDP. All right, so we have to have no recession will ever be 3 months long. All right, just by definition, the shortest recession that we could ever have would be 6 months. So we know that this is at least 6 months. Okay, it could be 9, could be 12, but remember, we measure GDP every quarter. It's a quarterly measure. All right, and so we've got a peak, a contraction. If that contraction lasts for 2 consecutive quarters, we go ahead and call that a recession. When we hit the bottom, so when we touch bottom down here, so there's the peak, there's the contraction. This is known as the trough. All right, that's the bottom. And then when we start on the upswing, we call that either expansion or it can also be called recovery. All right. Now, a couple notes to make here. Do you ever know the quarter that you're in the peak of the business cycle? And the answer is no, because what if, let me erase this for just a second. So what if we were sitting around and we said, you know what, here we are. at this point in time, right in the end of 2007, do we know what GDP is going to do in the future? And some economists predicted what would happen, but not many. And so some people thought it might keep going up like this. And if that's the case, we didn't know that we were in the peak here. We only know that we're in the peak and when we take a measurement for the next quarter. And so if the next quarter measurement's low, then we know that the previous quarter was the peak. Same as the trough. You know, if we're sitting here in the middle of 2009, and the economy is kind of in this free fall, at least parts of the economy are, do we know if the economy is going to do this or this or this? We don't know until we take that next measurement for the next quarter. And so looking at this graph, you know, we can see that the next measurement ticked it up, and so then we can identify that as the trough. All right, and so this is all there is to identifying the business cycle. Hang on just a second. I got some pen issues. All right, so by looking at this, looking at this chart, we can identify the peak. Peak here is at the top. Coming down is the contraction, otherwise called a recession when it hits 6 months. And then we have the trough, and then we have the recovery. Now, a couple things that I want you to look at as well. Let me find my line tool over here. Over the course of time, what's happened? I mean, we'll start here, and we end up here. And so what's happened to GDP growth over the last 22 years as a whole? And so you would say that GDP has definitely grown. If you look at the 90s, from 91 to 2001, this was a 10-year expansion. And this was from something I read the other day, this was the longest expansion in U.S. history. Okay, so this was kind of a big deal. Growth rates were going extremely well. As you can see, if we had followed this trend, we'd be way up here. That's not very sustainable. So a lot of people credit the growth in technology and computers and software applications in business for this, but productivity shot up. But anyhow, so you can see that GDP in the U.S., our average GDP growth rate historically has been somewhere around, you know, give or take, somewhere around 3%. And so if we have a GDP of 5%, you know, that's above average. So this growth rate might have been a little bit above. If we're at 2%, you know, right now we're kind of chugging along. We're in 2012, and hey, yeah. All right, sorry about that. Had a visitor and didn't want to have to start over. So anyway, I forget where we were, but this is our 10-year expansion. Right now we're sitting at about a 2% growth rate, 1.5 to 2. We are in August of 2012, so mediocre growth. If you look at other parts of the world, parts of Europe are in a recession, so they are on this downward slope. China, if we were to pull China's growth rate up, it looks they've been averaging somewhere around 9% growth for the last 15 or 20 years or so. And so China's growth rate is much faster than ours, and that typically is seen in developing countries. They grow faster than developed countries until they kind of hit a certain point. So anyway, these are the phases of the business cycle. Let me show you this one other graph real quick. This is, let me get my line tool again, this is the percent change in growth from one period to the next. And so you can see that here's the recession. They're still shaded. And so what I want you to take note of is here's the zero line. And so let's kind of just draw this over as parallel as we can to the axis. What I want you to look at is from here to here, what do you think is happening to the economy? Is it growing or is it shrinking? Okay, same thing from here to here, or here down to here. Okay, what's going on in the economy? And so if you said it was shrinking, that makes visual sense because the thing's going down, but this is percent growth. Okay, and so we would say that here, you know, we might have had, let's bring it over here, say 4% growth. Here, this is just saying we had, you know, 1% growth, but it's still growing. The economy is growing as long as it's above this line. Okay? And so you can see going from here to here, or even here, the economy was still growing, but it was growing at a slower rate. All right, so here the economy is growing at a faster rate than before, and then when we come down the other side, we change colors here, we come down to the other side, we're still growing, but we're growing at a much slower rate than we were before. So anyway, you'll see this graph on some IB type questions, and so you need to be aware that just because this is going down doesn't mean that it's a decrease in GDP. It's a slowdown of the growth of GDP. Only when we get negative, so if we go from here to here, that is a decrease in GDP. All right. So what about here? What's going on in the economy once we move from here to here? Is the economy getting better? Well, it in some senses, but the economy is still shrinking, at a rate of 3%. And so we would say that we're still decreasing here, but at a slower rate because we got up to a point where it was, negative 8% growth or not 9, whatever this number is. And so the following months or quarter, we still shrunk, but not at as fast as we were shrinking before. So this is somewhat good news, but it's still a negative number, so that's bad. It's just not as bad. Whereas this is good, and this is good, but this is not as good as before. All right, so let's see where we're at on time. We're going to go ahead and stop this video here. So this is just the business cycle, and in the next video we're going to look at changes at why business cycles occur in the first place. So until next time.